the silence at Dyatlov Pass. The mountains always held a silence that was deeper than anything I had ever known. A silence that didn't just press against the ears, but seemed to reach inside the body, filling the chest cavity, rattling in the hollow places between the ribs. I thought I had known cold. I thought I had known stillness, but the Ural Mountains taught me otherwise. The journey began with the white plains stretching endlessly in every direction, the snow crust glittering like shattered glass beneath the pale glow of the sky. The trees were skeletal, thin pines clinging to the frozen soil as though they had long forgotten the warmth of the sun. My breath emerged as a heavy cloud, lingering in front of me before drifting away, as if even the air itself hesitated to move too quickly in this place. The further I climbed, the more the wind became something unnatural. It whistled low at first, like a whisper threading through the fabric of the valley, but the higher I went, the more it sharpened into a keening sound, a drawn-out lament carried over the ice. The snow shifted beneath my boots, crunching down into the powder, sometimes giving way to a sudden softness that pulled me deeper, as though the mountain wanted to consume me one deliberate step at a time. There was no one else around. The world stretched empty, no sound of wildlife, no rustle of wings, no paw prints along the snowdrifts. Only my own tracks behind me, leading back into a vast emptiness that grew darker as dusk approached. I reached the place where the wind carried a different odor, faint but undeniable. Not the clean scent of snow, not the sharp clarity of frost, but something metallic, almost like rust. A strange heaviness in the air, as though iron had been ground into dust and scattered across the ice. The smell reminded me faintly of blood, though diluted, as if buried deep beneath layers of snow. It was then I saw it, the remnants of the tent. Half collapsed, the canvas was stiff with ice, edges curled inward like an animal's lips pulled back from its teeth. Snow had half consumed it, a mound rising against one side, the fabric sagging with frozen weight. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the rattling of loose fabric that flapped weakly when the wind struck just right. The tent was torn, no, not torn, but ripped open from the inside. I crouched closer, my gloved hand brushing against the edge of the tear. The fibers had frayed outward, as if desperate hands had clawed their way through. The snow around the entrance was disturbed, old depressions in the crust still visible despite the days that had passed. Bare footprints, naked feet pressed into snow so cold it should have burned like fire. They trailed away into the trees beyond, stumbling and erratic, vanishing into the shadowed forest. I felt the weight of the cold then, heavier than before, as though the air itself pressed closer against me. My lungs fought for each breath, the air sharp as shards of glass when it filled me. I hesitated before stepping inside. The tent smelled wrong. A mixture of sweat, damp wool, and something else, acrid, faintly charred, like ozone after lightning. The sleeping bags lay open, as though abandoned in haste, scattered with belongings that no one had taken. Boots lined the inner wall, untouched. Coats folded neatly, as if laid aside for just a moment. I touched the fabric of one, stiff with frost, but still intact, still usable. No one had carried them away. They had left everything behind. The snow inside was stained in places, darkened patches where liquid had frozen into jagged crystals. I didn't want to imagine what it had been. I pulled back, retreating to the threshold, and glanced again at the footprints that vanished into the woods. Something compelled me to follow them, though every instinct in me screamed to turn back. The forest was black at its edges, the trees standing like thin sentinels, skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The footprints staggered between them, growing faint, sometimes buried beneath fresh powder. The deeper I went, the stranger the air became. The smell of metal grew stronger, mingled with something sweet and cloying, almost like decayed fruit hidden beneath the snow. The silence pressed down harder. Even the wind seemed to hesitate here, gusts dying as quickly as they rose. My ears strained for any sound, cracking branches, shifting ice, anything to remind me the world still lived. Instead, there was nothing. And then I saw them. The first body lay sprawled on its back, arms flung wide, face tilted toward the blank sky. The skin was pale blue, lips darkened, but the expression, it wasn't the calm of someone who had frozen in their sleep. It was twisted, mouth open as if caught in the final moments of a scream that never ended. Snow had half buried the chest, the fabric of the clothing stiff with frost. The second was nearby, curled against the trunk of a tree. Fingers dug into the bark as though trying to climb, nails broken and bloodied. His eyes were open, clouded over with frost, staring at something above that I couldn't see. The silence roared in my ears then, louder than the wind, louder than the pounding of my heart. I knew the stories. I had read the reports before I came here. 9 hikers gone into the mountain, found scattered in strange positions, some nearly unclothed, some with injuries no fall could explain. But standing there, seeing them with my own eyes, felt unreal. No words on paper could prepare me for the way the air pressed down, how the snow seemed to tremble beneath my boots as if holding its breath. Further still, I found more. A pair huddled together, their skin bare in places where the clothing had been torn away, as if stripped deliberately. Frost clung to their eyelashes, their mouths slightly open, frozen mid-breath. Their bodies leaned into each other, yet there was no warmth between them now, only the frozen bond of death. The worst lay deeper in the woods, a ravine carved through the snow, the earth beneath exposed like an open wound. At the bottom, shadows pooled, and within them the broken forms of the last few. One with his ribs caved inward, as if crushed by impossible force. Another missing eyes, sockets sunken in black. A girl with her jaw twisted open, tongue absent, mouth filled with frozen crystals. The silence there was unbearable. I stood above the ravine, unable to climb down, unable to move closer, and yet unable to look away. The smell was faint but undeniable, iron decay, something sharp and sour that had no place in the cold. The trees stood around the clearing as if watching, their bare limbs arching over the scene like bent spines. The snow beneath me shifted then, faintly, as though something had stirred deep below. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The wind didn't move. The forest held its breath. And in that stillness, I understood why they had torn their way out of the tent, why they had fled barefoot into the night, why they had scattered into the woods as though hunted by something unseen. It wasn't madness. It wasn't panic. It was the silence. That silence that wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. A silence that pressed into the skull, that clawed against the inside of the ears, that filled the mind until reason fractured. A silence so heavy it crushed bone, so sharp it cut away eyes and tongues and voices. The mountain did not need teeth or claws. It had silence. I don't remember turning back. I don't remember the walk to the tent or the descent down the slope. All I remember is that the silence followed me, stretched thin across the valley, lingering with every step. It clung to my skin, settled into my lungs, and whispered in the marrow of my bones. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, the sun had begun to rise, casting the snowfields in pale pink light. My tracks stretched behind me, lonely lines across the vast emptiness. The wind had returned faintly, but it no longer felt like mere air moving across the mountain. It carried something else with it. It carried the silence. And I knew, even as I left the pass, that it would never let me go. The last descent of Marco Siffredi. The mountain was not silent. That was the first thing I understood once I stood upon its frozen slope. It breathed, it sighed, it whispered with every current of wind that twisted itself around the jagged rock and glittering snowfields. I had thought Everest would be still, stoic in its immensity, but it was alive in ways that pressed against the chest and gnawed into the marrow. The air itself was a blade. Every inhale burned my throat, searing with a dryness no water could soothe. Every exhale clouded into the brittle morning, as though my very soul were draining from me. The snow beneath my boots crunched with a sound too sharp, like glass splintering under weight. Shadows moved slowly across the slopes, drawn long and thin by the cold light of the sun that barely seemed to touch the earth. I followed the line of the ridge upward, where the Hornbeam couloir opened like the throat of some unkind beast. The passage stretched impossibly steep, a chute of ice and darkness carved into the face of the mountain. Somewhere above it, Marco Siffredi had disappeared. The stories said he wanted to carve his way down Everest with a snowboard, to trace the impossible line of descent where no one else had succeeded. They said he reached the summit on a pale September day, stood where the world curved into emptiness, and began his final ride. They said his companions watched him slip into the white veil of the couloir, and then he was gone. Gone without a fall, gone without a cry, swallowed whole. I wanted to see what had taken him. The higher I climbed, the more the air pressed down, thin as paper yet crushing like stone. My legs burned, muscles trembling with the weight of each step. The wind clawed at me, tearing at my clothing, carrying with it a scent I could not name, dry, metallic, almost like lightning-struck stone. It lingered at the back of my tongue, bitter, unnatural. Above me, the sky was a blue so sharp it felt less like color than an absence, a hollow dome stretched taut. The sun was pale, a coin behind gauze, unable to warm, unable to comfort. My breath rasped like sandpaper inside my chest. The couloir yawned before me. Its walls were black ice, sheer and glistening, streaked with pale veins that caught the light in broken fragments. The chute plunged downward into shadow, a tunnel that looked less carved by nature than by the deliberate hand of something that wanted it there. The silence here was different than anywhere else on the mountain. No wind reached the bottom. No shifting snow broke the stillness. It was as if the couloir had been hollowed out to trap sound, to drink it whole before it could escape. I lowered myself into it, boots grinding against hard-packed snow. The ice was slick, the surface scarred with faint grooves that cut in wavering lines, too shallow to be natural, as though something had carved its passage here once before. I followed them downward, each step heavier, the air colder, until the light began to thin. The shadows deepened. The walls closed in. And then I saw it. A shape half buried in the snow, its edges blurred by frost. At first I thought it was a rock jutting from the ice, but as I drew closer I saw the colors beneath, faded fabric, stiff with ice, torn by edges of stone. A scrap of bright material, the faint curve of something once whole. The remnants of a snowboard, fractured, the bindings twisted as though by violent strain. The air pressed harder then, my breath catching in my throat. The silence became unbearable, louder than sound, a roar inside my skull. The walls of the couloir glistened with a faint sheen. Not ice, not snow, something darker. Thin rivulets etched themselves into the surface, frozen mid-flow, black against the white. I reached out a gloved hand, brushed the surface. The ice was slick, smooth, but left a residue on the fabric, something that smelled faintly of metal, faintly of decay. I staggered deeper. The slope steepened until I slid more than walked, boots struggling for grip. My heartbeat pounded against my ears, louder with each step, until I could no longer tell whether it was my pulse or something else echoing within the chute. I felt eyes on me, though I knew there was nothing. The couloir was empty. The mountain was empty. And yet I felt watched. The grooves in the snow grew stranger the further I went. Not mere lines, but deep gashes, curving, twisting, as though something immense had clawed its way down the passage. They crossed and overlapped, weaving into a pattern my eyes could not follow. The shadows shifted across them, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. Not the movement of snow or light, but of something beneath, pressed within the ice itself. The air grew warmer, faintly, as though the couloir held a pocket of breath not meant for human lungs. The smell thickened, sweet and sour, cloying, mixed with the metallic tang that coated my tongue. My head swam, vision narrowing. And then I heard it. Not sound, not voice, but a vibration deep within the chest, a resonance that had no source in the world around me. A low hum, so deep it rattled my bones. It was not carried on the air, it was inside the air. It grew with each step, each heartbeat, until the walls themselves seemed to tremble with it. I fell to my knees in the snow. My hands sank deep into the cold crust, and I saw beneath the surface not white but a faint shimmer, like glass stretched thin over something alive. Faces blurred, staring upward with hollow eyes, mouths twisted open. They pressed against the ice, distorted, shifting as though caught mid-scream. The hum grew louder, until it was no longer hum, but a roar that came from nowhere and everywhere. The snow beneath me buckled, sagged, as though it were no longer solid. For a moment, I thought it would collapse entirely, swallowing me whole into whatever waited beneath. And in that moment I understood. The mountain had not let Marco go. It had not cast him down its slopes, had not broken him on its rocks. It had taken him, drawn him inward, pulled him through the silence and the hum into the hollow beneath, into the veins of ice where faces pressed and screamed forever unheard. The snowboard was only a remnant, a scrap left behind. The rest of him was here. I tried to rise, but the snow clung to me, heavy, sucking at my limbs. My breath came in ragged bursts, my vision spun. The hum became unbearable, until it felt as though my skull would split. And then, just as suddenly, it ceased. The silence returned. I staggered upright, trembling, and clawed my way back up the slope, dragging myself from the couloir with what strength remained. The higher I climbed, the weaker the pull became. The air thinned, the shadows lightened. When at last I emerged onto the ridge, the wind struck me again, sharp and clean, filling my lungs with a pain I had never welcomed so much. I looked back only once. The couloir yawned below, black and endless, its mouth waiting. The grooves in the snow stretched downward into shadow, fading into nothingness. The silence there was absolute, heavier than before, as though it had swallowed my breath, my heartbeat, my very voice. And I knew that it still held him. Marco Siffredi had made his descent. It was his last, and the mountain had kept him. Forever.